Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah for Latter-day Saints. Today, I'm actually going to take a break from the books because I realized that we maybe did not have enough historical context to really understand everything that was going on. I sort of rushed you through it really quick. So we're going to give you today a lot more context for the Persian period, what's going on, as much as we have. Like I've said before, the Persian period is a little bit of a blank slate for us, but as much as we have, I'll go through and try to explain what's going on so you guys can understand the context and what Isaiah, this Trito Isaiah, is saying here. Now this is some interesting stuff because we have, there's actually a debate on how much we have from the Persian period. Some people think that we have all kinds of things from the Persian period and that like most of the Bible's written in the Persian period. I just don't buy that. The reason I don't buy that is because of dating texts philologically. What do I mean by this? We can go back to ancient Israel. We can look at things like letters that have been written and inscriptions and things like that, people carving stuff onto stone, and we can say, oh, okay, this is what Hebrew was like at this point, before everybody left for Babylon. So, if it reads like that, then we can say with a certain level of confidence that that book in the Old Testament is from before the Babylonian exile, right? So that is how we do this. That's how we date these texts. And a lot of that, when you actually do the analysis, there's quite a few texts that are early. The other problem that we have is sometimes there's linguistic updating. We've talked about this before. Sometimes people will go through and they will update a text later into later Hebrew so that it reads a little better, but actually the content reflects an earlier time. Many scholars now have come to that conclusion with Jeremiah, that even though the text of Jeremiah does not reflect what we would expect from Jeremiah's actual Hebrew, it's later Hebrew and it's not Northern Israelite. Jeremiah is from Anatote. In North, it should be early Northern Israelite Hebrew, but it's not. But the content is all what we would expect from Jeremiah's time. And so it's very likely that someone has simply come through and done some linguistic updating of the book of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is all kinds of messed up in other ways. And if I had time, I would do a Jeremiah for Latter-day Saints, but I do not have time. But that is one of those things that is a good case study for us as we're looking at Isaiah, that yeah, there's probably been some linguistic updating. But that's the trouble when we're dating texts generally, is how much of this has been linguistically updated? Hard to say. It's very hard to fake pre-exilic biblical Hebrew. People really, they try to fake it, but they don't quite succeed. They tip their hand in various ways. But as far as post-exilic stuff goes, you could still have a pre-exilic text that was updated in post-exilic times. So I tend to date a lot of things, pretty early. And, but there are a few things that we know are late. And so I'd like to talk about some of those things as a way to give context to what we're getting here in Trito Isaiah. Like I said, the language of Trito Isaiah is pretty late. So that's why I tend to think that it's late. Once again, it could just be linguistic updating, but I don't really think so. I think he responds often enough, specifically to issues in Ezra and Nehemiah, that we're actually dealing with the Persian period here. But let's give some history to sort of make sense of all this. So, all the way back in Isaiah's time, right? We talked about this the other day. He has the problems with the Assyrians, and that's what a lot of his actual work is about. But then, what happens? The Assyrians take over Babylon. And so the Babylonians were not happy about this. They bided their time. They eventually became a bigger power than the Assyrians did. So you have the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and then you had the Neo-Babylonian Empire. They became an even bigger power than the Assyrians, and in somewhere around 612-ish BC, the Babylonians take Nineveh. the capital of the Assyrian Empire. So then you have the Babylonian Empire. They go out and conquer the ancient Near East too. Theirs is slightly bigger, and that's what tends to happen. You'll have original empire. You'll then have another empire absorb it. It gets slightly bigger. That's what happens here. The Babylonians absorb the Assyrian Empire and some other stuff, and then get slightly bigger. Then eventually when the Persians take that over, it becomes even bigger still. When Alexander the Great takes that over, it becomes even bigger still, right? And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger until after Alexander the Great stuff collapses. But anyway, with this, you have the Babylonians taking over the Assyrian Empire, and in 586 BC, around there, they take Jerusalem. Now, this is hugely important because everything's different after this. And we know this from the Book of Mormon. We know about this. Lehi is always talking about this, that, yeah, Jerusalem's going to get destroyed. Babylonians are going to come in and destroy Jerusalem, right? And he knew that it was going to happen, so he got out of Dodge, because God told him to, and went to the New World. But that is the context of the Book of Mormon, is the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem in 586 BC. Now, this destruction meant that a lot of people got deported to Babylon, and there they likely met people that had been deported before under the Assyrians. But they're there in Babylon, and that's what we call the Babylonian exile. Or so when I say pre-exilic, I mean from before the Babylonian exile. So this is a very important date. And you can actually see changes in the language from before and after this date. As you can imagine, this is a pretty dramatic thing. So when I say pre-exilic, I mean before this. And when I say post-exilic, I mean after this. So the question then is, how did they ever come back? And the answer is a guy named Cyrus. So out in Iran, present-day Iran, is this guy named Cyrus. We'll know him eventually as Cyrus the Great. He consolidates the Persian tribes out there and creates this pretty big kingdom and decides he wants to turn that kingdom into an empire. So he goes out west and he starts conquering stuff. And in 539 BC or thereabouts, he conquers Babylon. There's a fun story about this, that he decided to go. I think this is in Herodotus, but you get a few different things with this. But one of the stories is that he goes up to the city and realizes that Babylon is these really thick, crazy walls that are impossible to get through. But then remembers, oh well, the river goes through it actually. So all you have to do is redirect to the river, and then you can walk in through the riverbed where the river used to be and just walk right into the city without taking it. So that is apparently what he does. So yeah, according to some historical records, he diverts the Euphrates and walks right in. Who knows if that's true or not, but it's a fun story. But Cyrus takes over the Babylonian Empire, and suddenly, in 539 BC, he owns a lot of the world, right? He has all of what is today Iran, basically, and actually some stuff up into Central Asia even. This is a very, very large empire. And he takes over the Fertile Crescent area, the Babylon and Assyria area, and then also down into Judah. And has some problems with the Egyptians, but this is this really kind of huge world-bestriding empire that the Persians have created, at least as far as the ancient world is concerned. So in 539 BC, he takes this stuff over, and his policy is a little bit different. Back in the day, everybody just wanted to be tougher than the previous Mesopotamian ruler. They figured that was the only way to win. Kill a lot of people, deport a lot of people, crack some heads, and really make sure that nobody sort of talks back to you, right? Well, that didn't necessarily work, right? I mean, like I've said, you've got the Assyrians with decorations that are severed heads hanging up in their gardens. That's not really working out for them, actually. The tougher they were, the more people kind of hated them. And so Cyrus says, you know what, this empire is too big for me to rule by being just a tough, angry guy. I need to change my tack if I want to actually rule this empire. So he changes his ideas rather completely, and he says, "Okay, guys, you want to have your local laws? Great, I'll help you systematize your local laws." He does that down in Egypt, actually. He helps to system after finally getting a foothold in Egypt. He helps to systematize some of their local laws in Egypt and uses that as the law of the land. And that may be what he did in Israel too. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he has decided that he's going to take this widely diverse empire and say, you know what, you want to worship your local gods? Fine, great, I love it. You want to worship you want to have your own law system? Fine, as long as you actually have a real systematized law system, I can help you with that if you want. So he has decided he is just going to change how he does business, and he's not going to try to rule with an iron fist. And that works pretty well for him, actually. Honestly, it works pretty well for him for a long time. Now, it's not going to be across the board how this is done, and it's definitely not how it's going to be seen by the Greeks. The Greeks are going to see these guys, the Persian rulers, as tyrants. That's probably overwrought, but compared to what it used to be, the Persian Empire is a pretty chill place to live, and so that is how he's going to rule. And like I said, it actually works out pretty well for him. He's not like he's sort of nice by modern standards, but compared to what it used to be, it was very good. So part of this is, when he takes over Babylon, he finds all these Jewish exiles and says, hey guys, maybe you guys want to go back and rebuild your temple. And so that actually is preserved for us. This story is preserved for us in Ezra and Nehemiah. And we have to mention briefly, when Cyrus conquered Babylon, I mean, usually when you conquer a place, you destroy or capture or something, you otherwise humiliate the deities. And so you can say, oh, look, see, our deity beat your deity, we're the best. He didn't do that. What had happened was, in Babylon, there was this sort of worthless king, Nabonidus, in Babylon, who had ignored all of the rituals surrounding the main Babylonian deity, Marduk, as he was out there in the desert worshiping the god Sin, I think it was. And so the people were very upset that this Nabonidus guy was just worshiping the moon god and not worshiping Marduk. And so Cyrus came to Babylon and then was like, hey guys, I'm in Babylon. Marduk actually brought me here because he said his worship was being neglected or something. So I came back to restore the worship of Marduk. You're welcome, right? And so he was treated like a liberator almost by some of these people. And so that's why when you get the stuff in Deutero-Isaiah talking about gods being hauled away, these Babylonian gods being hauled away, that doesn't really fit with what Cyrus was doing. That didn't really fit with his program. And so it's very likely that that's talking about the Assyrian conquest of Babylon, not the Persian conquest of Babylon. But that was his sort of way of doing things. And he eventually says, okay, you guys can go back. You Jews can go back and rebuild the temple. Now, some people have doubted that this happened, but I think we have no reason to distrust this. This is Ezra 4, 1 through 6. And he says, the enemies of Judah and Benjamin were asked to help build the temple, and when this was denied, they got counselors, and they were going through and building the temple. And he says, yeah, go ahead and go back and do this. Now, we actually have a cylinder, it's called the Cyrus cylinder, which says, yeah, Cyrus let captives in Babylon return back to their homelands. It literally says, from Babylon to Ashur, from Susa, Agade, Eshnuna, Zambe, Meterna, Dur, as far as the region of Gutium, the sacred centers on the other sides of the Tigris, whose sanctuaries had been abandoned for many years, I returned the images of the gods the statues of the gods who had lived there to their original homes, and I let them live in their eternal dwelling places. I gathered together all their inhabitants and brought them back to their dwellings. In other words, he restored the worship of the gods to where they were supposed to be, and the inhabitants as well. I also, being commanded of Marduk, my great lord, I settled in their living places, in pleasing dwellings, the gods of Sumer and Akkad, that Nabonidus, to the anger of the lords of the gods, had brought into Babylon. So he's saying, yep, I'm restoring all the gods to where they're supposed to be. I'm restoring all the people to where they're supposed to be. So for him to come in and say, yeah, everybody go back and you guys can rebuild the temple, and that's fine, that's actually going to be not that weird. And so Ezra 1:1-8 says that the Lord inspired King Cyrus of Persia to issue the proclamation, having people go back. And actually, when you go and read that, that is in Aramaic. A lot of that stuff there is in Aramaic. That's sort of what you would expect, actually, for something from this time period. Because the Persians had taken over an empire that ran speaking Aramaic and worked pretty well in Aramaic, they just kept Aramaic as their administrative language, even though they were not speaking Aramaic at the time. Aramaic's a Fertile Crescent language, not an Iranian language. But they just kept it, and so it's very likely he would have written something like this in Aramaic when he's dealing with that part of the empire. And so it's actually not so strange to think that they literally just more or less copied this thing down. They may have tweaked it slightly, but they more or less copied this thing down in Aramaic. So in this decree, he says, yeah, guys, go back. Go ahead and go back home and rebuild the temple. Now, the thing is, though, a lot of these people, this has been a long time. When you think about the chronology here, it's been quite a few years when he finally tells them that they can go back. But when you think about the timeline, so Babylonian falls in 539, but the Jews aren't allowed to go back. The first wave aren't allowed to go back until 538, the next year. But when you think about that, that's a really, really long time. Like we said, this is 587 or 586, somewhere around there, probably more like 586, all the way down to 538. That is a very long time. Okay, that's a solid 48 years, roughly, until people go back. So a lot of these people have lived in Babylon their whole lives, so they're like, well, I don't really want to go back. Thanks, though. So you actually have only a very small group that goes back. The rest of the people stay in Babylon. That's why a lot of the Jewish, really big, important Jewish stuff that we get from later on comes from Babylon. The Talmud, one of the main Jewish texts, comes from Babylon, because there was a giant Jewish population in Babylon because they just didn't go back. And that seems crazy to us, but if you've lived there for a long time, you're like, well, I'm just going to stay here. Babylon's my home now. I've never even seen this place for a lot of these people. So you've got some older established adults that have seen it, but these are old people by this point. So a lot of these people just don't want to go back, but you do eventually. You get some people that go back. So 538, you get people starting to come back. They start apparently to maybe fix up the altar there on the Temple Mount and slowly start to build the temple. But then you have some issues with the Samaritans trying to stop the building of the temple somewhere around 525-ish, somewhere in there. And that is a pretty big issue that they have to. There's all this sort of fighting back and forth and letter writing back and forth with the Persians. This is in Ezra and Nehemiah. I say Ezra and Nehemiah because it's actually one cohesive book in the Hebrew. It's broken up in English and in the Septuagint, but it's just Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew. So you've got the Samaritans trying to halt this. And then apparently they rediscover the Edict of Cyrus saying that they could go home and rebuild the temple sometime in there, in maybe 520-ish, something like that. And so the temple is finally rebuilt in the 6th year of Darius, which is around 515. So you're finally getting the temple being built. So when we have in Trito Isaiah, he's talking about the building of the temple, and that's, I think, what we're getting, these struggles of people pushing back and trying to keep the temple from getting built. And he's saying, no, guys, we have to do this. We can't just sit on this. And so you're going to get that throughout a lot of these prophets, actually, that they'll talk about, hey, like, here's all these things going on with the temple. You guys need to stop dragging your feet and rebuild the temple. A lot of prophets will talk about that. And even after the temple's built, they say, well, you need to do the rituals of the temple better, right? So a lot of this revolves around the difficulties in building the temple, people that are dragging their feet and not building the temple, and then finally getting the dang thing done. Now, we don't... This is one reconstruction. It's not the only reconstruction. It could be that some of this is later, because we have contradicting evidence in the text. So some of this stuff may be much later, into maybe the 480s. So I'm not going to try to give you hard and fast dates for Trito Isaiah during this period. I've given you some dates because it's nice to have something to hang your hat on. But we need to realize that those are maybe not the best thing. We have to understand the very real possibility that these dates could be very different. So the historical context is temples being rebuilt. I'm not going to try to give you a solid year on this because it's very hard to pin down. Because you get... maybe even, like I said, in the Xerxes era, of somewhere between 486 and 465, this directive for the Jews to rebuild the temple. And then so the first wave of Jews comes back, and the altar is restored, and the foundations of the temple are laid. Apparently this is happening in waves of Jews returning to rebuild the temple. So it's a little bit confusing. You get this guy Ezra, who comes back. He's in exile. He's commissioned to come back by the Persians and sort of get things going. But that's hard to say when that is either. Is this maybe 458? Is it 428? It's very hard to say. But somewhere in here, you've got this guy Ezra who's commissioned to come back and get things in order there in Jerusalem. And you've also got this guy Nehemiah who's commissioned to come back and rebuild the walls and sort of get things in order. Now, I won't trouble you with some of the strange reasons why this is so confusing, but it is very difficult to sort all this out. And some people have even put Ezra and the second wave at 398. So this is a huge swing. We just don't know. But regardless of when this all is, it's pretty likely that the context is the temple. Okay, so, and even with Zechariah gives you some more or less solid dates, but those dates depend on certain things that we don't completely know. So the temple is the context of this. The rebuilding of the temple is the context. And dealing with being a little tiny outpost in the Persian Empire is the context. And dealing with your neighbors hating you is the context. You got to remember, not everybody was deported. Not everybody was deported to Babylon. So you had people that stayed back and just lived on the land in Jerusalem, in the Judah area. And when the people come back from Babylon, they're seen as outsiders. They're seen as interlopers. And so there's major fighting between these groups. And you've got the Samaritans, too, who are like, hey, can we help on the temple? And the Jews coming back are like, no, you can't help on the temple. You guys are not even a thing. What do you mean, can you help on the temple? You guys aren't strict worshippers of Jehovah, you have all these other gods. You can't help. Which may be ill-advised of them, honestly. But anyway, maybe they should have let the Samaritans help. But anyway, there's this then fighting back and forth between these people. And so, and actually at some points it's talking about them holding swords in one hand and trying to work on these construction projects, the temple and then the walls around Jerusalem, which is a sort of a two-way thing, while they're fighting off these guys, right? So it's very a very difficult situation that these people are in. And that's how we have to see this. We have to realize the struggles that these people have been through. And so let's talk very briefly about the prophets that deal with some of these issues. And I should say that I'm going to step astride into minefield here, head erect, with realizing that I'm just going to get blown to pieces on this. Dating is one of the most difficult things here. So I'm just going to walk right into the minefield and just realize that that's what we're doing right now. It shouldn't be that hard. But like I said, there's issues relating to dating because of the style of language and all this other stuff. And because people are silly sometimes and they don't read Hittite or Hurrian texts, which would change what they think about some of these things. But that's a story for another day, too. So the books that are around this time, some people think that parts of the Law of Moses were written around this time. This is almost certainly untrue. Like I said, if people read Hittite, they would realize that that's incorrect. But that's okay. There may be a little bit of editing for the Law of Moses during this period, but probably not that much. But with 3rd Isaiah, with Trito Isaiah, you've got, in this period, you've got some prophets that are dealing with the issues of this time. Haggai is one of those. Zechariah is one of those. Malachi is one of those. Ezra and Nehemiah is written during this time. Chronicles is written during this time. Those are things that we can really pin down pretty well. Job is a little bit more complicated, although Job may be late. Some of it's got to be early because it's quoted in the Book of Mormon extensively. Ecclesiastes is the same. Although one of the issues that we have with these is that some of these late texts rely a staggering amount, on earlier texts and quotations from earlier texts. And so some of these things may be late but rely heavily on earlier texts. Ecclesiastes is probably pretty late, but relies almost certainly on earlier material. Song of Solomon's probably in the same ballpark. Later texts, but relying on some earlier material. Job, although much of it may be early, it itself is probably late and then relying on earlier material. Jonah, the language of Jonah is late, but it also seems to rely on early material, although part of it's very early and is quoted in the Book of Mormon. Chapter 2 of Jonah is very early and is quoted in the Book of Mormon, but the rest of it is probably later during this time period. A lot of the Psalms are during this time period. And so that's kind of what we're getting here. So you've got these books that are written later that help to give us some context. So let's look at Haggai as one of these books that is written during this time period that helps to give you some context. So Haggai is written, if we're optimistic, 520 BC. Once again, the dating is difficult. Of all these historical events is difficult. But if we're optimistic, this is 520 BC. And this is during the period when the temple is being rebuilt. So that's the key thing, is that the temple's in the middle of being rebuilt. So Haggai is like, okay, guys, you need to hurry up and rebuild the second temple. You need to rebuild the temple. You've been dragging your feet. He says, there's been a drought recently. Why do you think there was a drought? Because you guys didn't go and rebuild the temple. So he's really urgent in saying, you guys have got to go do this and rebuild the temple. And during this time period, we have to remember something else that's going on in this period. Jerusalem is not independent. It has walls, and it has, and actually the people that stayed behind are fighting back against Jerusalem having walls and being like, you shouldn't let Jerusalem have walls because it'll rebel against you once it gets walls. The Persians eventually are skittish about that, but then they don't believe that anymore, and they let the walls be built. But it's not independent. So you have actually this guy Zerubbabel, who's the governor during some of this time period, and he is actually a descendant of King David, almost certainly. And so you get these issues here running through all of this, that they're not independent. They're just, this guy Zerubbabel, he probably would have been in line for the throne, but he's just a governor now. And so that's going to play a part as we go through Trito Isaiah. But Haggai is saying, you guys, this drought happened because you guys did not rebuild the temple. You guys have to hurry up and do this. And so Isaiah is going to talk about this. Guys, you got to rebuild the temple. When you rebuild the temple, things are going to actually be really great for you guys. And even like now, as it's just being finished, it's hard to know exactly where he is in this, but he's saying, guys, go to the temple, do worship properly in the temple, and things will work out well for you. So that's sort of where Haggai is positioned in all of this. And with this, we also have to talk about Zechariah. Like I said, I think that this is maybe Zechariah. If it's not Zechariah, it's somebody like him in the same sort of sphere with similar ideas. One of the things that we talk about is we've got these issues of Zechariah saying, okay, what about these fasts, right? You guys are fasting and mourning over the temple being destroyed and the city of Jerusalem being destroyed. That happened a long time ago. I understand why you're doing this, but maybe you need to think about something else here. Maybe we need to be done with this. And so when we get what we had last time, or a couple times ago in 58, that's exactly what Trito Isaiah is saying too. He's saying, guys, maybe your fasts are not, maybe you guys should be done with this. Maybe you should think about the poor rather than sort of obsessing about mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem with these fasts. Zechariah is going to talk about some very interesting things at the very end of his book. He's going to talk about everybody coming up to the temple and all of Jerusalem being holy. He says that actually all nations are going to come up and keep the Feast of Tabernacles at the temple in Jerusalem, and those that don't are going to be destroyed by the Lord. He says, in that day, and then he says that after this, everything is going to be consecrated to the Lord. He says, in that day there shall be upon the bells of the horses holiness unto the Lord, and in the pots in the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. Yea, every pot in Judah and Jerusalem shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts, and all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seed therein, and in that day there shall no more be the Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. Now this section is very interesting in light of stuff that we're going to get in the book of Isaiah. That he's going to talk like this in Trito Isaiah of, we need to be more inclusive of all nations coming up and worshiping in the temple. So there's these connections as we go throughout here back to Isaiah. And that is pretty interesting to me. Another thing that may be significant is the image of God going out and fighting. You're going to get this in Zechariah chapters 9 through 14. Zechariah 14 specifically, 14:3 talks about God going out and fighting for the people. And didn't we just see that in Trito Isaiah, that God puts on his armor and he goes out and he fights for the people? So there's all these little things that make you go, well, this could well be Zechariah. Like I said, there's not enough to really tie it down, but it's very possible that this is him. He would be around the same time. He's talking about similar issues of mourning and rebuilding of the temple and purity in relation to the temple So these things make me go, this may well actually be. If it's not him, it's somebody like him in the same sort of circle as him. We get spoiled, frankly, with the Book of Mormon because we always know who wrote what. With the Bible, we're just not that lucky. We don't really know who Trito is. I like Trito, and he's a good prophet, whoever he is, whether we have his name or not. And we just sort of get spoiled, right? We don't know in the Bible who Trito is. We know who the Book of Mormon authors are. We know Mormon, we know Nephi, we know Moroni. We don't know all their sources, but we know them. Whereas, I don't know who wrote Joshua through 2 Kings. I don't know. We just don't know. We know a few sources that they've got. We know who wrote a couple of those, but that's about it, right? So there's lots of things we just don't know who wrote them, and some of these things are anonymous. Ecclesiastes is actually anonymous. People have taken it to be Solomon, but it's anonymous. We don't know who it is. So there's lots of things like this, and we just have to kind of be okay with that. As much as that frankly pains me, we just kind of have to be okay with that. And like I said, we don't need to know who this guy is to know that he's a prophet. Like I said, my money's on Zechariah, but I'll never be able to prove that. There's not enough tight information to really be able to pin him down exactly. You may be able to run some analysis of this. There's something called stylometric analysis that allows you to use function words, just a random word that you have to use to fill in a sentence. Those are different from person to person. So I can analyze those words, and I can actually figure out who wrote things in various languages. But you need a lot of text still to do that reliably, and I'm not sure we would have enough between Zechariah and Trito Isaiah to be able to do that in Hebrew. Maybe we would, but it's difficult. And once again, we have to consider editing issues. Some people think Zechariah is by two people even, right? So all of these editing issues give us problems, and would make it very hard to do good old-fashioned stylometrics on this stuff. So that's one of the issues that we've got here. So another prophet that we have to think about in all of this is Malachi. We don't actually know who Malachi is. Malachi might be a name. It could also just be my messenger, right? So once again, we just don't know. This could be just about anybody, although once again there are similarities to Zechariah. Zechariah may have been a very busy man, although he wouldn't have been nearly as busy as stuff we know from Isaiah himself, even if this was all him. But once again, it's somebody in that vein if it's not him. And like I said, we don't know who this is. The Book of Mormon maybe suggests that this is somebody else, that this is a separate person, but it's actually hard to say. So some scholars actually, I'm not the only one to propose the Zechariah-Malachi connection. Some scholars have noticed that Zechariah 9 through 14 especially is like Malachi. So it could be him, but we just have no idea. But he is talking about similar things, but he is talking about the temple. He's pretty heavily talking about the temple and about ritual purity related to the temple and about rebuilding things appropriately. But this is around the same time. This is the same kind of milieu where he's saying, guys, you guys have got to worship properly. You guys can't bring lame, blind animals up and think you're going to worship those or sacrifice those, and that counts as good worship. So this is the environment that we find ourselves in, of people dragging their feet to rebuild the temple, finally rebuilding the temple, and then not really doing it right. They do all the outward ordinances. They go through it in a sort of rote way, but their heart's not in it. And that's what we got in Trito Isaiah. We're going to get a lot more of that too in Trito. People are doing this in sort of this rote way, but their heart's not in it. And that's a problem. And the prophets are telling them, guys, this is a problem. You really can't be like this. And so in all of this, we're getting some of these issues, and we're getting people that are pushing back. against some problems of the time. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah, like I said, it's a chronological mess, but it's written during this time period. Chronicles is written during this time period. And Chronicles, we're going to get, once again, a really significant concern with the temple in Chronicles. There's a lot more temple stuff in Chronicles than there is in the earlier material from Kings that it is sort of an echo of. They're very, very concerned about the temple in Chronicles. So this is the world of Trito Isaiah. And we have to realize that as we're going through this. Now, people are trying to deal with all these issues in different ways. People are in a world where they know that things were destroyed. The Babylonians destroyed the temple back in the day. Now they're back, but they're under a foreign power, and it's hard for them to deal with it. And people deal with it in different ways. Chronicles deals with it by trying to tie all Israelite history into with a nice little bow, and say, well, things were great, and then things were bad because the kings were bad, and so we got punished for our sins, and we don't have to deal with the issue of why bad things happen to good people. We know why the bad things happen, because King Manasseh was a punk, and some of these other kings were punks, and nothing that good kings did after that could make up for how much of a punk this guy was. And so that's what happened, and we all got taken away. Job is not quite so cut and dried. Job, which is also trying to deal with this issue during this period, says, well, I don't know about that. Maybe bad stuff just happens sometimes. Maybe it's inscrutable. Maybe we just don't know why. Maybe bad stuff just happens. And Job, you get Job talking to God, and God responds to Job out of the whirlwind and says, Job, were you around when I made the earth? No. Were you around when I made all these big crazy animals? No. So why do you think you can call me out about what happened with all of this stuff? Sometimes bad stuff just happens. You need to deal with it, Job, right? So that's another answer to the question that we get here. And that answer is, an answer. It's maybe the most realistic of answers. Ecclesiastes is just kind of depressed, right? In Ecclesiastes, it's like, well, lots of bad stuff happens in life, and that's just the way things go. And you're like, well, okay, there's that too. So you run the whole spectrum of responses to what's going on here. There's a whole spectrum of how do you respond to these really, really difficult issues. And it's hard to know. It's honestly very hard to know. And that's this world. They're trying to respond to having had the temple being destroyed and now being occupied by the Persians. It's not as bad as it could be, but they're not independent. There has been some droughts. The temple's trying to be rebuilt, but it's a little bit rocky. And even when the temple's rebuilt, people are just going through the motions, and their heart's not really in it. And so Trito is trying to deal with all of these issues and try to make sense of the world. And so for us, Trito is very helpful because we can look at him and say, you know what? Life is not ideal. But he tries to figure it out anyway. And that's all we can really do too. Life's not ideal, but he tries to figure it out. And what does he say? How does he deal with the issue? He says, God is going to someday make everything okay. That's how Malachi deals with the issue too, incidentally. He says, yeah, things are bad now. Sometimes you have good people that bad things happen to, and bad people that good things happen to. But someday God, when all this is over, God's going to make everything okay. And that's Malachi may even be thinking of the next life in that sense, that eventually in that sense God's going to make everything okay. And we may get some of that in Trito, but Trito is also thinking of the future. Someday, God's going to make everything okay. And that's Zechariah's image. He has this eschatological end of time image in which God makes everything okay. And we're going to get a lot of that in Trito. But we have to keep all of these ideas in play, that they're trying to respond to these issues, and they respond in different ways. And we're going to see glimmers of these different responses in Trito as we go through it. So anyway, that's it for this sort of historical introduction. We'll get back to the book itself next time we do this, but thanks for being with me today, and we will see you guys next time.